What happens when the most feared man in New Orleans hires the one woman his broken little girl won't scream at? And she isn't a socialite, a trained therapist, or anyone's idea of a hero. She was a 26-year-old waitress from the Tremé with tired feet, a busted alternator, and $300 left in her checking account. But when a silent, terrified 7-year-old chose her over everyone else, the entire criminal empire of the Gulf Coast shifted on its axis. Callum Devereaux did not ask for help. Men like him never did. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and built like someone who had spent his 20s learning exactly how much force the human body could absorb before it quit. He ran the Devereaux Syndicate out of a restored Creole mansion on Prytania Street, a sprawling, beautiful fortress of pale yellow plaster and black iron lace that looked like something from a Southern Living spread and functioned like a weapons depot. He controlled 3 shipping terminals along the Mississippi, had the ear of 2 city council members and a federal judge, and had not, in living memory, raised his voice to get what he wanted. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. The only thing Callum Devereaux could not control was his daughter Simone. She was 7 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's iron jaw, and for the 14 months since her mother's funeral she had not spoken a single word. Not one. The grief counselors said it was selective mutism, a trauma response, completely treatable with time and patience and the right environment. 3 specialists, 2 occupational therapists, and 1 very expensive child psychologist from Tulane had cycled through the Prytania mansion in the past year, each of them eventually surrendering with the same hollow phrase, "She needs more time." What Simone needed, as best anyone could tell, was for the world to stop smelling like her mother's perfume and expecting her to be okay. What she did instead, with breathtaking consistency, was throw things. Not random things, targeted things. She had an unsettling eye for projectiles. The heavier ceramic vase over the decorative crystal one, the hardback book over the paperback, the solid brass candlestick over the hollow aluminum one. The third therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Pellerin, who had spent 15 years working with traumatized children, had quietly packed her bag and walked out after Simone launched a snow globe at her temple with the accuracy of a major league pitcher. Callum's head of household staff, a wiry Cajun woman named Mrs. Tureau, who had worked for the Devereaux family for 22 years, had started wearing a bicycle helmet indoors. She was not joking. It was Mrs. Tureau who eventually called the Magnolia Domestic Placement Agency with a desperation in her voice that she would later describe as begging, outright begging, something I have never done in my life. Patrice Odom heard about the job on a Tuesday morning, standing at the service window of a dry cleaning shop in the Tremé, where she picked up dropped shifts when the tips at the restaurant were thin. She was 26, 5 feet 3 inches tall, and weighed exactly 278 pounds on the scale in the bathroom of the apartment she shared with her Aunt Celestine on St. Claude Avenue. She had wide hips, thick arms, a round, warm face that her grandmother had always called a face people trust, and the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes not from never being knocked down, but from having been knocked down so many times that you've stopped being afraid of the floor. Her mother had died when Patrice was 11. She had grown up moving between relatives, holding things together by sheer force of personality and a refusal to let anyone see her come undone. She had 2 years of community college, a food handler's certificate, a cosmetology license she never used, and the unshakable belief, tested constantly, never quite broken, that she was capable of more than anyone looking at her was willing to see. The placement agency had called her because she was at the bottom of the roster. 3 more experienced candidates had already turned down the Devereaux job. The brief was vague by design. Private household. High net worth client, childcare responsibilities for 1 child age 7. Child has experienced recent loss and requires a patient, resilient caregiver. Compensation is 4 times standard rate, paid weekly in cash. 4 times the rate. Patrice did the math in her head, standing at the dry cleaning counter, her phone pressed to her ear. 4 times the rate for 14 weeks, which is how long she needed to pay off the balance on Aunt Celestine's hospital bill, the one from the cardiac episode in March that the insurance had refused to cover in full. She had been working 3 jobs since April. She was exhausted down to the marrow. The last placement we sent, the agency coordinator said, her voice carefully neutral, left after 2 days. What happened? A pause. The child is expressive. Patrice looked out the window at the street. A pigeon was eating a beignet off the sidewalk. Someone had left their bicycle chained to a street sign with the front wheel missing. "I'll take it," she said. 2 hours later, she took the streetcar up St. Charles and walked the last 6 blocks in shoes that were slightly too small because her good flats had a broken strap and she hadn't gotten around to fixing them. The August heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the garden district like a damp wool blanket. By the time the wrought iron gates of the Devereaux property came into view, her blouse was damp at the back, and her hair, which she'd spent 40 minutes pressing smooth that morning, had made its own decisions. The guard at the gatehouse looked at her the way people always looked at her when they expected someone else. That flicker of recalibration, the barely there pause before the professional mask slid back into place. He murmured into his radio. He checked something on a tablet. He opened the gate without another word. The driveway was lined with old magnolias, their roots buckling the pavers in places. The house beyond them was enormous and achingly beautiful, the kind of old New Orleans architecture that had survived hurricanes and decades and still managed to look like it was winning. Patrice walked up the front steps and reminded herself to breathe. A man opened the door before she could knock. He was 60-ish, slight, with a silver mustache, and the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades making himself invisible in the right rooms. He introduced himself as Bernard, just Bernard, and led her without preamble down a wide central hallway, past framed oil portraits and a table with a flower arrangement that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Mr. Devereaux will see you in the study," Bernard said. "I'd recommend you don't sit unless he offers." He opened a door at the end of the hall. The study was lined floor to ceiling, with bookshelves on 3 walls, and anchored by a fireplace that wasn't lit, but looked like it meant business. Callum Devereaux stood with his back to the door, looking out the tall windows at the garden, and he didn't turn around immediately. She understood in that first second that this was intentional. When he did turn, Patrice felt the full effect of him like a weather system changing. He was tall, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, with a face that would have been handsome if it weren't so exhausted. Deep-set dark eyes, a jaw like a closed door. He wore a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his forearms had the particular density of a man who had never stopped using his hands. He looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, completely, assessing, missing nothing. "You're the 3rd one this week," he said. "Not unkindly, just factually. The agency keeps sending me people who are qualified on paper." "I don't have a lot of paper," Patrice said. "I have a food handler's cert and a cosmetology license I never activated." Something moved in his expression very briefly. "Then why are you here?" "Because I need the money, Mr. Devereaux, and I'm not easily scared." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those door-shut eyes. "My daughter threw a full water glass at the last woman's face. Did she hit her?" "Directly. Good aim." Another pause. Longer. That's not the response I expected. "It's a 7-year-old who lost her mother," Patrice said. "She's not throwing at people. She's throwing at the feeling. The people just keep walking into the feeling." Callum Devereaux said nothing. He uncrossed his arms, which Patrice would later learn was about as close as he got to showing. He was surprised. Before he could respond, they both heard it. A sound from somewhere above them, a high, wordless shriek, and then a crash so substantial that the framed Audubon print above the fireplace rattled on its hook. Bernard appeared in the doorway, looking both resigned and helmeted. He was, in fact, wearing what appeared to be a vintage motorcycle helmet in a muted burgundy. "Simone is awake from her nap," Bernard said. Callum's jaw tightened. "Take Miss Odom," Patrice said. "Take Miss Odom upstairs. Let's get this over with." Patrice followed Bernard up the curved staircase, listening to the sounds from above escalate into a sustained, furious, wordless keening that bounced off the plaster walls. She could hear objects impacting surfaces. She could hear Mrs. Turreau's voice, high and frantic, and the sound of something ceramic shattering. Bernard paused at the top of the stairs and turned to her with the expression of a man delivering last rites. "She's in the yellow room. I will be directly below." "Well, just shout." Patrice walked to the end of the hall alone. The yellow room had been at some point a cheerful and carefully decorated child's space. Buttercup walls, white furniture, a cloud mural on the ceiling with small painted birds. Now it looked like the aftermath of something geological. A ceramic lamp was in pieces near the window. Every book had been pulled from the low shelves and scattered. A stuffed rabbit was missing one arm. In the center of the room, Mrs. Turreau stood pressed against the wall with her arms up, the bicycle helmet doing its job, while a small girl in a yellow nightgown stood on the bed, chest heaving, dark eyes blazing, a hardback picture book drawn back over her shoulder like a picture winding up. Patrice stepped into the room, and Simone's arm froze. The girl stared. 7 years old, and she already had the kind of face that showed everything and hid everything at the same time. A heart-shaped face with enormous dark eyes, her father's jaw set at a furious angle, her hair in 2 lopsided braids that had started the day neat and were now mostly undone. She looked at Patrice the way a cornered animal looks at something it can't immediately categorize. Patrice didn't move toward her. She didn't hold out her hands. She didn't say it's okay or sweetie or calm down or any of the words that adults always said when they wanted children to stop inconveniencing them with their feelings. She stood in the doorway, looked at the room and said, "That must have been a really big storm inside." Simone's eyes narrowed. The book was still raised. "Because that's what it feels like, doesn't it?" Patrice said. Her voice was low and unhurried, the voice she used with Aunt Celestine during the bad nights. "Like there's a big storm right in the middle of your chest and you can't make it stop, and everybody keeps trying to talk to you like talking is going to help. But it doesn't help. Nothing helps." The book came down, fractionally. Patrice walked to the low window seat, slow, deliberate, giving the girl every opportunity to track her movement, and sat down. She was a large woman, and the window seat was not built for large women, but she sat on it anyway, shifting her weight until she was settled, and then she looked out the window at the garden. "You don't have to talk," she said. "You don't have to do anything. I'm just going to sit here for a minute because it's hot upstairs, and I walked 6 blocks in the wrong shoes and my feet hurt." She pulled off her right shoe, looked at her heel, made a small sound of commiseration with herself. Behind her she heard the bed creak. She did not turn around. She heard small feet hit the floor. She heard the rustle of the nightgown. She heard the cautious, padding approach of a child who had learned that adults were unpredictable and was testing the theory. Simone appeared beside her at the window seat. She looked at Patrice's bare foot, then at Patrice's face, then out the window. Then she sat down, not against Patrice, a careful 6 inches away, with a rigid posture of someone maintaining terms. But she sat. Mrs. Turreau, still pressed against the wall in her bicycle helmet, made a sound that was part sob and part hallelujah. Patrice didn't look at Simone. She looked out at the garden where a fat orange cat was sleeping in a square of afternoon sunlight near the herb beds. "Is that your cat?" she asked, to no one in particular, to the window. A pause. Then Simone's small finger appeared, pointing. At the cat. That was all. No words. just the finger and the direction. But it was the first purposeful communication the child had made with anyone outside her father in 14 months. And downstairs, Callum Devereux was standing in the hallway at the foot of the stairs, with his eyes closed and his fist pressed to his mouth. He had heard the crash stop. He had heard Mrs. Turreau's sound, that particular combination of relief and reverence. He did not know exactly what had happened upstairs, but something had shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a storm breaking. When Patrice came downstairs 40 minutes later, alone, Simone, having fallen asleep, curled against her side on the window seat like something that had finally run out of reasons to fight, Patrice found Callum waiting in the hallway. He looked like a man who had just been told his test results were good and didn't quite believe it yet. "How?" he said. "I didn't do anything," Patrice said honestly. "I just didn't run from it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Mrs. Turreau will show you your room. Double the rate they quoted you. You start Monday." "I start now," Patrice said. "She's going to wake up in a strange house with a stranger. She should see a familiar face." Callum Devereux, who had not taken a direct instruction from anyone in approximately 2 decades, nodded. The weeks that followed rewrote the atmosphere of the Britannia house, the way a long overdue rain rewrites the air after a drought. Not all at once, and not without resistance, but with an accumulating momentum that eventually became undeniable. Patrice did not fix Simone. She would have been the first to say so, plainly and without apology. What she did was stay. She stayed through the mornings when Simone woke screaming from nightmares and wouldn't be touched, and Patrice just sat on the floor outside the door and talked. About nothing. About the weather, about what she was planning to cook, about the orange cat whose name, it turned out, was Biscuit. She stayed through the afternoons when the rage came back, and Simone threw things, and Patrice let her throw them. Cushions only. They had negotiated this, wordlessly, through a series of exchanges that operated entirely in gesture and expression, and then sat quietly until it passed. She stayed through the evenings when Simone would appear, still silent, and climb into the wide, soft berth of Patrice's lap and simply exist there, like a child who had found a temperature that was finally right. Callum watched from a distance. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life in the background of rooms, reading them, and he read this the way he read everything, carefully, completely, with all the patience of someone who understood that the most important things were always happening slightly off-stage. He noticed that Patrice sang while she cooked. Not performed, sang for herself under her breath, the kind of half-remembered hymns and R&B ballads that a person sings when they think nobody's listening. He noticed that the kitchen, which had been a functional and largely joyless room since Simone's mother died, smelled like something was actually being made in it again. Beignets on Friday mornings, a slow red beans and rice on Mondays, cornbread that had Callum's entire security detail, 6 armed men between the ages of 28 and 55, congregating near the kitchen door on Sunday afternoons with the hopeful expressions of rescue dogs. He noticed, too, the way Patrice carried herself in his house. She was a big woman in a house full of lean, hard, expensive things, and she moved through it with a quality he could only describe as unpretentious authority. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for the space she occupied. She rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon because she felt the configuration wasn't conducive to a child feeling safe, and she simply did it, without asking. And when Callum came home to find the room completely reconfigured, he stood in the doorway for a long moment and said nothing, because she was right. He found himself coming home earlier. This was something his lieutenants noticed and discussed among themselves with the particular discretion of men who had survived this long by reading the room correctly and keeping their mouths shut. He found reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings. He found that he had questions about Simone that turned, somehow, into conversations about other things. About Patrice's aunt. About growing up in the Tremé. About what it felt like to learn at 11 years old that the person who was supposed to catch you was gone, and you were going to have to figure out how to catch yourself. "You just do it," Patrice said one evening, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of chicory coffee, watching Biscuit attempt to extract a piece of cornbread from a sealed container. "You don't have a plan. You just get up because the alternative is staying down, and staying down is its own kind of hard." Callum was leaning against the counter across from her, a glass of bourbon at his elbow, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the assessing look, not the careful, controlled executive function look. "Something rawer. I stayed down," he said after Simone's mother. "For about 6 months I just ran the operation on autopilot and let everything else go to hell." "I know," Patrice said simply. "Simone told me." He went very still. "She told you?" "Not with words. But yeah." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "She carries it for you. The way she watches the door when you come home. She's been checking that you're still there. She's been checking since the funeral." The silence in the kitchen was very full. "I didn't know," he said finally. "You've been grieving too," Patrice said. "You're allowed." It was not a profound statement. It was a simple one, plainly delivered, without performance. But Callum Devereux sat with it for a long time after. Patrice said good night and went upstairs. What unraveled the quiet of the house came from outside it, the way the worst things usually do. A man named Whitfield ran a mid-tier collections and loan operation out of Metairie, the kind that preyed on neighborhoods where the banks didn't go, charging rates that compounded faster than people could breathe. Patrice had taken a loan from Whitfield's operation 2 years ago, before she fully understood what it was, to cover the down payment on a car that subsequently broke down and was totaled in a fender bender 3 months later. She had been paying it down steadily from 3 jobs, but when she came to work at the Britannia house, the security protocols were strict enough that leaving the property required Callum's advance approval and an escort vehicle, which meant her access to her Metairie bank branch was limited, and she fell behind on a payment. She didn't think much of it. She called, explained, made arrangements for the following week. What she didn't know was that Whitfield's people had already made the connection between her employment agency records and the address she was working at. And what the connection meant to Whitfield's operation was considerably more interesting than a missed loan payment. The Devereux Syndicate's security grid, the gate codes, the patrol routes, the camera blind spots, the shift rotation of Callum's personal security team, was worth a great deal of money to the right buyer. Whitfield knew a buyer, and Whitfield now had a direct line to someone inside the walls. She found out at Mass. Callum had, in the 3rd month of her employment, begun allowing Patrice to take Simone to Sunday morning Mass at the Tremé church where Patrice had grown up, 3 blocks from her aunt's house. It was the first outside activity Simone had tolerated. The routine of it, the music, the incense, the particular quality of light through old stained glass. Something about all of it seemed to quiet the storm in the child without requiring her to participate in it. Callum's men were there, plainclothes at the 4 corners of the church, but they gave distance. After Mass, Patrice walked Simone to the corner to see the neighborhood cats that lived behind the Creole restaurant, a tradition they had established after the 2nd week. She was crouched down, showing Simone how to hold out her hand so that Tabby would come to her when a car pulled to the curb, and Whitfield's man, a thin, sharp-faced person she had met once when she signed the original paperwork, stepped out. He was pleasant. That was the worst of it. How pleasant he was. He explained the situation as if he were describing a weather pattern. Patrice owed money. Patrice had access to something valuable. The math was simple. "I work for a private household," Patrice said, her voice steady while her insides turned to ice. "I clean and do childcare. I don't know anything about security schedules. You know more than you think." He glanced meaningfully at Simone, who was still crouched by the cats with her back to them, apparently absorbed. "And the man you work for has a very particular soft spot. We'd hate for anything to interfere with the child's well-being. Wednesday, you'll hear from us with specifics." He got back in the car. He drove away. Patrice did not move for a full 10 seconds. Then she straightened up, took Simone's small hand in her large one, and walked back to the waiting SUV without letting her face show a single thing. She spent the next 4 days in a state of silent, methodical terror. She stopped sleeping in any useful way. She moved through the house doing her job, singing to Simone, making the food, sitting in the window with biscuit in her lap. But the warmth had gone out of it. She was operating from somewhere cold and scared, going through the motions. The cornbread didn't come out right on Sunday. Simone noticed, looking at it with a slight frown, and looked at Patrice, and the look said something is wrong as clearly as if the child had spoken it aloud. Callum noticed by Monday morning. She watched him watch her across the breakfast table with those dark, reading eyes, and she looked away and talked about nothing, and she felt him deciding not to push yet. By Tuesday evening she had a plan, and it was the only plan she could think of, that didn't end with someone getting hurt. She would leave. She would pack her bag tonight. She would leave her last week's pay in an envelope on the kitchen counter with a note that said she was sorry. And she would get Aunt Celestine and get on a bus to Baton Rouge before Wednesday morning. She would keep Callum and Simone out of it entirely. It would gut her to do it. She would miss Simone with a ferocity that surprised even herself. But the alternative was unthinkable. She was sitting in the dark in Simone's room, watching the child sleep, when Callum appeared in the doorway. He didn't turn on the light. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms and looked at her in the way he always looked at things he was taking apart to understand. "You're leaving," he said, quietly. "Not a question. I think it's better. Who is it?" She looked at him. In the low light from the hall, his face was all shadow and jaw, and those dark eyes that never stopped working. Patrice. Her name in his mouth was a different thing than she expected. Not commanding, not imperious. Close, almost. Private. "Who put that look on your face?" The dam held for about 4 more seconds. Then she told him. She told him about the loan, the car, the missed payment. She told him about the man outside the church, the pleasant voice, the unpleasant math. She told him about Wednesday and the specifics she was waiting to hear. She told him that she had not for 1 second considered actually giving them anything. That she would burn herself down before she let anyone use her to put Simone in danger. "I know," Callum said. His voice was very quiet. "I already know." She stared at him. "What?" "My security lead flagged an approach to your location at 11:47 Sunday morning. We identified the individual by Tuesday afternoon." He paused. "I was waiting to see what you would do." The combination of feelings that moved through Patrice in that moment was complex enough that she couldn't name any of them individually. She felt seen. She felt furious underneath both of those, something that had no good name. 9. "You were watching me," she said. "I was watching out for you," he said. "There's a difference. And the fact that you were about to blow up your entire life to protect Simone instead of coming to me." He stopped. Something shifted in his face. "You didn't think I'd believe you." She didn't answer, because he was right, and they both knew it. Patrice. He uncrossed his arms and walked into the room, and he crouched down in front of her chair, the way she had crouched in front of Simone that first afternoon, putting himself at her level on purpose, and that deliberateness undid something in her chest. "Whatever gave you the impression that you were, I need you to understand that I intend to correct it." She looked at him, up close, in the low light with the careful composure set aside. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was trying to figure out how to put it down. "I'll take care of Whitfield," he said. "Tonight, you don't need to know the specifics. And I'm not going to tell you, but he will not approach you or anyone connected to you again. I need you to believe that." "I believe it," she said. And she did. That was the thing about Callum Devereux. When he said a thing like that, with that particular quality of stillness, it wasn't a threat. It was a fact about the future. "Good." He looked at her for a long moment. "Now stop planning to leave my house." Whitfield's operation went quiet by morning in the way that things went quiet when Callum Devereux decided they should. Patrice didn't ask. He didn't tell. What he did do was appear in the kitchen at 7:30 Thursday morning while she was making beignets, sit on the stool at the island and tell her, unprompted, about his wife, about how they met, what she was like. Quick, sharp, funny in a dry, quiet way that always caught him off guard. How the cancer had been fast and the end had been faster, and how Simone had been there and had seen more of it than any child should, and how he had not known, until Patrice said it, that his daughter was watching the door to make sure he was still coming back. Patrice listened. She didn't offer comfort in words. She slid a warm beignet across the island and kept making the next one, and Callum ate it in silence. And the kitchen was full in a way it hadn't been in over a year. It wasn't a single moment that changed things. It was accumulation, the way weight settles, the way warmth spreads from one room to another. It was Simone, on a Friday morning in the 4th month, climbing into Callum's lap at breakfast and placing her hand flat on his chest, and Callum going very still, and Patrice watching from the doorway with a beignet pan in her hand and her eyes burning. It was Callum's security team, formerly the most intimidating collection of silent men in the greater New Orleans metropolitan area, competing to carry Simone's stuffed animals when she decided to move them from one room to another. It was Biscuit, who had formerly adopted Simone, and Simone, who had formerly adopted Patrice, and the three of them in the window seat on rainy afternoons with a library book and 2 mugs of hot chocolate. It was a Tuesday evening, the 5th month, Patrice at the stove, and Callum coming home from a meeting that had clearly gone sideways. She could read it in the set of his shoulders before she even turned around. And her, saying nothing, just sliding a bowl of red beans across the counter, and Callum sitting down and eating, and then sitting in the quiet of the kitchen for a long time, and that being enough. And it was this. One night in the 6th month, Simone spoke. It wasn't a full sentence. It wasn't even a full word, not quite. It was the first 2 syllables of a name called out from the hallway in a small, rusty, unpracticed voice at 2 in the morning after a nightmare, the voice of a child who had not used it in so long that it came out strange and creaking and absolutely perfect. She was calling for Patrice. Patrice was out of bed before the 2nd syllable, moving down the hall in the dark in her oversized sleep shirt and her fuzzy socks, and she gathered Simone into her arms and held her and rocked her and felt the child's voice against her collarbone, quiet, testing, coming back, and she cried silently into the girl's hair. Callum was in the doorway. She felt him there before she saw him. He had heard it too, and he stood with one hand on the doorframe and his head slightly bowed, and in the low light from the nightlight, shaped like a crescent moon, his face showed everything he had been keeping behind that closed door for 14 months. He looked at Patrice holding his daughter, this woman who had arrived at his house with broken shoes and a food handler's cert, and the complete, unshakable conviction that love was a practice, not a feeling, and that the most dangerous thing you could do for a person was simply refuse to leave. And Callum Devereux, who had not cried since the funeral, and did not intend to start now, looked away and pressed the heel of his hand briefly to his eye and didn't say a word. Later, after Simone was asleep again, the 2 of them sat in the kitchen with the Lewand cups of tea going cold between their hands, and Callum said, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" He looked at her across the table. "Want something I'm not sure I deserve." Patrice held his gaze. She had spent 26 years being told, in words and silence and sideways glances, that her body made her less worthy, less lovable, less deserving of rooms like this and men like this and moments like this one. She had never fully believed it, but she had never fully not believed it either, and she knew the weight of that doubt in a way that was so familiar she had stopped recognizing it as a weight. She recognized it now. She said, "Callum, the things that you think make you less deserving, the life you've built, 6 months, the things you've done. I know who you are in the morning before the armor goes on. I know how you look at your daughter when she doesn't know you're watching. I know that your security team would follow you into anything. Not because of what you can do to them, but because of what you've done for them." She paused. "And I know that you walked down a hall in the dark at 2 a.m, because you heard your daughter's voice after 14 months of silence, and you stood in that doorway and you let yourself feel it. That's not less," she said. "That's more. That's everything." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He had large hands, scarred and careful, and they covered both of hers entirely. "You walked 6 blocks in the wrong shoes," he said, finally. "I did. To come to a house with a track record of sending people away. I needed the money." "Patrice," she smiled. It was the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and honest, the smile of a woman who has been through enough to know that good things are not guaranteed, which makes them worth paying attention to. "I stayed because I wanted to," she said. "After the first day, I stayed because it was the first place in a long time that felt like it needed exactly what I had to give." Callum turned her hand over under his and held it. In the months that followed, the Britannia house finished the process of becoming something it had forgotten how to be. Simone's voice came back in pieces. Words first, then sentences, then one afternoon in the garden, a full unprompted declaration that Biscuit was the fattest and therefore the best cat in the entire city, which made Patrice laugh until she cried, and Callum, who was standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders, press his face briefly into her hair. Callum's men stopped being surprised to find Patrice at the breakfast table with Callum before the morning briefing. They adjusted. They brought her beignets from the bakery on Magazine Street. They stopped wearing their intimidating faces in the kitchen, which was Patrice's jurisdiction, and in Patrice's jurisdiction, the rule was that you sat down and you ate something, and you were a person for 20 minutes. The Devereaux syndicate noticed, as syndicates always notice, that the man at the top was different. Not softer, harder, if anything, in the ways that mattered, the focused and purposeful ways, but present, undivided, like a man who had something to come home to and had decided, with the full force of his considerable will, that he was going to be worthy of it. Patrice Odom had arrived at the Britannia house with broken shoes and $300, and a bone-deep certainty that she was capable of more than anyone looking at her was willing to see. She had been right. She just hadn't known yet what more was going to turn out to mean.